Just before we get into the content, just some context around remote channels for which Meta very much sits in. Since 2017, the divergence of remote channels from a sales contribution perspective has grown exponentially. So we've seen a lot of growth in this area. And although some organizations are really smashing digital and others are very much on that journey, we cannot ignore the importance of digital. And I think certainly at various conferences, we've been talking about that, and that's very much a known thing. And so these changes feel slightly like they're hindering our activity, but we're going to try and work through what it really means and how we can overcome this in the future and moving forward. So we're going to get straight into it. Data source categorization is the topic for today. We're going to go through a bit of a what is it and why, essentially. So for those of you who set up campaigns within Facebook's Business Manager, you'll recognize the screen on the right. This is an area where you select the source of data that you're looking to build your audiences from. So we're able to connect a number of different sources of data to Meta. And what Meta is doing is it's taking those various sources and it's putting them into different categories. And that's to help Meta better understand the services, products, solutions that you specifically provide. One of the reasons they're doing that is also to help their algorithms work out who is most relevant for you from an audience perspective, but it's also around a further point that I'll come on to in a moment, around them really understanding what data they've got. So those categories, which we'll go through in a moment, then determine the type of information that you're allowed to share with Meta. So the idea is if there is a restricted category or a sensitive topic, they're going to prevent that data coming onto their platform. Data travels, as I mentioned, in a number of ways onto the platform, but most commonly it's via a pixel. So the pixel code that you put on your particular website, that's hoovering up data and then sharing that with the Meta platform. Also customer list or customer list, which is data that you put into a CSV file and you upload onto the platform, and you can then remarket to those particular individuals, and or you may be sharing data via your CRM via a bespoke integration. So they're typically the most common, and I guess the most common out of those three is probably the pixel data. Pixels are on certainly the majority of the websites for the clients that we support. So that's a little bit about the data categorization piece, and then we're going to just now talk about why. So again, there are a number of reasons, and just trying to condense all this content into about 40 minutes. We're going to just kind of take high level. So the first one is around the protection and data privacy of the users of the platform. This is absolutely paramount, certainly in terms of organizations in the charity sector. That is absolutely paramount, but it's also paramount now for Meta. They've been on a long journey of improving the protection of data privacy, which we're going to go on to again more in a moment. But this is a real kind of stake in the ground for them. And the context of that is because, for example, if there was an individual on Meta who's got an account, a Facebook account, and they, for example, had a rare disease, really, it's not, as an advertiser, it's none of your business whether that individual does or does not have a rare disease. So there's a degree of protection around that. The idea being, if you were solely advertising to that type of group, that type of audience, then you have more knowledge about certain individuals than essentially you need to. And also, above and beyond that, if you're an organization who has a cure or a solution for those types of audiences, it's really, again, kind of none of your business whether you should advertise to them without their explicit consent. So I've kind of gone to the extreme there, but it's just to put that in perspective. The second why is it's all about Meta getting a handle of the data that's on their platform. So they've come under a huge amount of scrutiny, both in UK, Europe, USA, etc., around the type of data that they have, and also how they're processing that data. Some of it's very real, and there have absolutely been mistakes that have been made at a meta organization level. Some of it's perceived because of just the amount of information and data that they've got on most of the population of the world. But in any case, it's about them really understanding what kind of data they've got and also putting legitimate steps in place. So if you are sharing data with them, you are now, or certainly over the last couple of years, but increasingly in different ways, you're now being asked to verify that you have the right to share that sort of information, that those users that you're sharing information about are aware of that. It's in your privacy policy. And so on. So it's all about them avoiding reducing legal and reputational risks. And then the third one is slightly more spurious, but again, this is a growing trend. So Meta, because of diminishing quality of tracking, so things like the iOS updates and changes in how third-party data is now being shared and tracked, Meta wants to keep users as much as they can on the platform. Now, sometimes that is a really good thing, but if we look at donation tools via Meta, they're not always the most robust. But essentially, they want to keep as many of their users on platform as possible because, from their perspective, it enables them to deliver a better experience. They're in more control as to what content is being shared. And from an algorithm perspective, they're getting additional data reads on the type of content that people would be engaging in on a website, for example. If they've got that information and that engagement on platform, that gives them richer insights and should then make their ad platform more robust. But these changes are certainly not new. For those of you who've been advertising on Meta for several years, you'll recognise this image on the left, which was the Audience Insights tool. This was sunset a number of years ago, so it's no longer available. But it was a really, really decent, cool tool that allowed you to look at audience profiling, looking at pen portraits of certain audiences within certain demographics, geographies, interests, and you could genuinely build audiences based on data. However, more unscrupulous advertisers were using it to ill effect, and it was certainly felt by a number of organisations, government organisations, and then lastly, Meta came under enough pressure to get rid of it. So this happened several years ago, and just on the right here are some more recent news clippings, and there's one there that dates back to 2018. So the whole process of data privacy, transparency, this type of information that they're sharing with us now is trying to get them into a good place from a data management perspective. One of the other tools that we use quite a lot is the Facebook Ads Library, which essentially allows you to spy on your competitors. So you can look at other organisations' ads for a number of reasons. One of which may be to take some inspiration from them. But again, that step was implemented, by Meta, purely on the basis that they wanted to be transparent with what advertisers were advertising. So how it works, again, there are two core ways in which the categorization happens. So like with most things on Meta, there's an automated process. So Meta is using its automation to scan the content of your domain. So when you're building ads on Meta doesn't just look at the ad creative; it also has a check on your domain, and that's all part of, again, things like experience checking. So Meta wants to ensure that all users on the platform have a good experience, and if you're providing a good experience, your KPIs are often better, so you are rewarded. So your click-through rate, for example, would be higher if Meta determines that the experience is going to be good. And so one of those checks might be that it's looking at the content as to what you're saying in your ad. Does that marry to what's on the subdomain, for example? So there's an automatic scan, and then if the scan picks up any of the specific categories, a tag is then applied to your ad account. And a piece of detail there is that the tag is actually put on the data source. So it's not just on your ad account, it can be specific data sources. So for example, if you're running multiple pixels, there may be a tag on one of those pixels, but not on the others. If your main website or donation page is therefore heavily focused on sensitive topics that are in these different categories, then there may then be restrictions applied. And we're going to go into the topics, and we're going to go into the restrictions as well. So that's the automated process, much like real money gambling as a whitelisting process when you're applying for approval to serve ads on the platform. That process is largely automated, so it works very much in the same way. From a manual categorization perspective, there are also increasingly questions that are now being asked by Meta when you're uploading data or when you're connecting data. And I kind of shared or just lent on that a moment ago. So we're being asked, are these is this audience, sorry, aware that you're using their data? Do you have permission to use that data? And just a clear example of that is the use of lead forms. When you're building those leads forms in Business Manager, you already are asked to supply your privacy policy. So the privacy policy, we suspect, will also then have an automatic categorization applied to it as well. So when we first started looking at this and talking about it, it became evident that organisations were really only talking about charities that sit within the health and wellness vertical. So any organisation who's talking about specific medical conditions, health, patient relationships, portals, and wellness trackers. So we're aware that there's a number of organisations who have a wellness tracker. For example, you answer five or six questions, and it spits out some feedback. For example, that type of activity is being monitored very closely, and those types of health organisations are seeing their data sources being restricted. But it's not just limited to health and wellness. There are a whole host of other categories that you could fall within. Not all of these are going to be relevant to the charity sector because it's for all advertisers. But there are certainly a number of different categories that you should be aware of. So if your data source is tagged with one of these sensitive categories, Facebook may then apply one of three specific restrictions. So the first restriction is called core setup. And again, I'm going to show you what that looks like in a moment, but just to kind of go through some of the data. Core setup really restricts the effective use of the program, of the platform, sorry. So you can still advertise, absolutely, but it's essentially advertising with one hand behind your back. So what I mean by that is, for example, we will often use URLs that follow your main domain in order to effectively manage creative and audiences through the journey of sign up. So, for example, charityabc.org, that's the main organizational domain. If all of our traffic, if all of the individuals that we're advertising to go onto that website, and then some of them go through and buy, some of them abandon their cart, some of them look at specific content, not knowing that level of detail is really, really difficult, or it doesn't allow us to be effective. Whereas, for example, if we know that some of the, a percentage of the people that we're advertising to go to /support us, we then know, because we've got a digital trigger, that those individuals may be interested in in supporting your particular cause. So we might change up the type of creative to them. If we know that they've been on the support us page and they have then also engaged with content on / regular giving, that suggests that they may have a propensity or a higher level of intent to actually start giving you a regular, more frequent financial gift. And again, the tone of voice, the style, approach of creative is going to be slightly different. And then the last piece of that string is often the value. So regular giving / £25. We then know typically what kind of level of gift they have considered. So having all of that information allows us to generate a number of different audiences based on their propensity and intent level of giving. And it also allows us to then think about and craft very specific copy, imagery, video, etc., in order to engage with those audiences based on the journey that they've gone through. So not knowing any of that, and it then just being limited, the audience just being limited to this top domain, charityabc.org, takes away that effective use of the platform. The second piece is custom parameters. So typically when you have a pixel, for example, on your website, or if you're uploading data onto the platform, you can specify that somebody who gets to the checkout page, for example, has an arbitrary value of, let's say, £52 against them, and or when you're uploading data, you can put in there that that particular individual group of individuals has given up to a certain value. That helps Facebook go and find more of those types of people. But again, from your perspective, from a tracking perspective, you can look at the value of the different slices of your funnel. So if you have a KPI on a certain value being attributed to certain individuals coming in at top of funnel, and you're below that, then you know that you need to increase the level of traffic on top of funnel. With core setup enabled or being turned on, we essentially lose that information. And likewise, we lose information around what type of content potentially that they're engaging with. So we have 5 different ads running, and right now we would know that 1 or 2 of them are particularly engaging. That helps from a creative strategy perspective. That really helps us go away and create more creative that's working really well, and to stop the content that's not working so well. So again, not having that information is prohibitive. The third one is custom audience performance. So if you create a custom audience, that might be all of the people who came onto our website, visited support us, and visited the regular giving page or the lottery page. You could create a specific audience from that. And the reason you may want to do that is because you want to retarget some specific information to them, or you may want to create lookalike audiences and so on. With core setup, the custom audience performance diminishes over time, so it doesn't work as we would expect. Costs will then increase. The flip side to that is that we're just not able to create custom audiences at all, and again, that has a particular bearing on the effective use. And the last one is automatic advanced matching. I'm not going to go into so much detail around that today, but that's essentially the information, the additional information that Meta can collect on our behalf to enrich the use of retargeting and targeting on platform, but that's also not then available. When we're going to go through in a minute where to find all this information within your business manager, but this is essentially what it looks like once you're on platform. Within the settings of Events Manager, again, I'll show you this. It will say core setup on. Generally speaking, that should be off, and if you wanted to turn it on, you could. But if you see it's on there, then that does suggest that your account is restricted for some reason. Typically, that's because of data source categorization. The second the restriction is on events and also buying objectives. So, for example, when we're talking about having a funnel approach, mid and lower level funnel events like initiate checkout, add purchase information, and or purchase events. So these are individuals that have gone pretty much all the way through the journey. But if we know that somebody added their purchase information but didn't actually purchase, we need to put some more content in front of those individuals. But they then go away. And likewise, the ad accounts are then also restricted to a handful of objectives. So the top of funnel objectives typically are awareness, traffic, and engagement, and that's then all you can use. Whereas leads and sales, which is most prevalent for this conversation, they're then grayed out and or not available. So not having sales enabled really is a particular restriction. And then the third one, restricted full restrictions. This is the most nuclear, really, from a restriction. This just basically doesn't allow you to advertise anymore, so you're just not able to use the platform. Often full restrictions come in again, everything seems to be in twos or threes, but everything full restrictions, come in kind of two flavors. The most common is just you have a red warning box on your business manager account that says that you're unable to advertise, and other restrictions are imposed where your performance just degrades over time. So they just your costs become very high, engagement becomes very low. So you essentially switch off that particular campaign yourself. But then you can't then reignite it afterwards. So we're going to just do a very quick walkthrough now of how to check the data source category restrictions. This is a bit of a kind of a verbal or written walkthrough, and I'm just going to go through a more visual approach. One of the documents that we've created for the end of this session, if you'd like it, is a more detailed review of how you go through this process and typically what it is that you're looking for. So step one is to log on to your business manager, which is business.facebook.com. Once you're on Business Manager, you then want to typically it's on the left hand side in the menu is Events Manager. So Events Manager holds all of your data sources. So click on Events Manager and then you're selecting data sources. So that then allows us to see the data sources that have been connected to your particular ad account. You may have several different pixels here, and so I would absolutely recommend you go through each one of these pixels, because what we've actually found from an audit perspective is that a number of organizations, generally speaking, their pixel data sources are fine, but there's one rogue one for some reason. It might be that it's connected to an agency who's been running some very specific wellness tracker type activity, for example, and that's then been restricted. So definitely go through all of the pixels that are connected. But in this case, there's just two in this example. So you would select this particular data source, go to settings, and then scroll down to manage data source categories. So this is the section that will basically inform you whether there's a restriction in place or not. By clicking manage, it then opens up a box, which I'll show you, which would then contain information that's relevant to the source categories. What we would say is that not all advertisers have the managed data source categories section within Business Manager, and that's likely because you're not in any of the categories. And if your performance hasn't been impacted, it's not diminishing, costs aren't going up, that would also suggest that you're not in a restricted ad account. So clicking manage then opens up this box. And this is where your data source or your domains in particular would then be listed. So in this example, there are no domains or restrictions listed. The restriction is under the status page. So if you go through that process and you identify that you do have a restriction and you feel that it's an incorrect tag, you can then request a review. So if you select on that previous page, you can then click the button that says request review. You give some narrative as to why you think it's incorrect, and that is then submitted to Meta. That review process is also very likely to be automated, so it may just be a one-way answer, but it's certainly worthwhile doing. In some cases, we have seen no restrictions applied at this level, but there has evidently been an issue due to performance, and so we would then recommend contacting Meta directly by opening a support case. Again, in a number of the cases that we've dealt with, the issue has actually come down to one, as I said before, one rogue pixel which has a restriction on it. The other pixels are fine, content is fine, but it's that one specific pixel. The other piece to this is the settings around social issues, elections, or politics. So as part of the whole privacy and transparency piece, Meta also wants advertisers to make a disclaimer that ads are being run for one of those particular elements. So if you're seeking to influence public opinion, you're debating government, challenging a health bill, challenging or standing up for social rights, that would be classed as one of the social issues, elections, or politics, and you need to declare that. And again, that's very important from a transparency perspective, so that users on the platform can make up their own mind as to whether they want to engage in that type of content or not. But what we would say is that we also see ads running on behalf of organisations using that disclaimer that necessarily aren't correct. So we would absolutely advocate just reviewing your use of that selection, because by doing that, there are also potential sensitive categories that are then applied or could be applied to your ad account and could then lead to specific restrictions unnecessarily. We're not saying it shouldn't be used. We're saying it should be used, but just in the right context. And examples of those ad types, just like the previous ad categories, are here. So civil and social rights, health, immigration, and anything really to do with challenging government or particular political values. So, for example, around the election, those types of ads absolutely need to be categorized correctly. So hopefully that's been interesting and informative from a perspective of what data categorization is, what it means for you from a restrictions perspective, and a bit of context as to why it's come about. What we're going to do now is just look a little bit at future planning. So from a future perspective, these types of changes, but when you look back as far as 2015, these types of changes were coming into force, and so they're going to become more and more prominent. In my opinion, I think the platform will become more and more kind of pinned down, and there'll be a greater reliance on that piece around keeping users on platform. So relying on Meta campaigns as we were using them just 12 months ago is certainly a mistake. There's typically a cycle of change every 6 months on Meta. And so, we think it will become more and more prominent. In 2024, the successful use of the platform was really determined by creative and by having a specific funnel in place. So funnel is determined really by creative. So the type of language that's used, the tone, and how we implement your particular product. So when we're talking about signing up to a lottery or winning a prize, if nobody or if a certain group or audience doesn't know about your cause and you're going straight in asking them to sign up to a lottery, you probably haven't quite earned the right to talk about that yet, especially if they don't know anything about your organization. So we want to be a lighter approach than that. So at top of funnel, we want to talk about organization, the values, your impact, the stats around your organization. And then if people engage with that content, take them on a journey with different creative. Creative is far more powerful, really, than the audiences that you're using, certainly right now. And so, from a funnel perspective, we would ensure that your strategy aligns to that. Why this is relevant for data source categorization is because if you're only able to run traffic, or you're only able to look at awareness campaigns, your secondary mode of conversion may be telephone, so lead generation, for example, which works particularly well. So awareness and consideration, top and middle of funnel on platform, and then divert the users onto your own subdomain, which typically don't get caught by these restrictions. Check your categorization regularly, and it's kind of a no-brainer. But if you are incorrectly categorized, make a request for review. And then from a privacy policy perspective, we still come across situations where privacy policies probably aren't as quite robust as they could be. So you need to ensure that if you're using lead generation and Meta to generate leads or engagement, and you're going to then use that data to re-put it back into the Meta platform, you need to be really clear about that. And so just reviewing privacy policies. And then the last one from a future perspective is use the ads disclaimer around social issues and elections and politics in the correct content, in the correct context. So I made a quick comment about subdomains then, and we wanted to just kind of go through this in a little bit more detail. So it's quite common for organisations to have a dedicated microsite or subdomain, lottery.charity ABC. And we massively advocate that is the case from a use case perspective for a number of reasons, but really from a marketing perspective, it allows you to be a little bit separate from organisational brand conversation and just really focus on the impacts of organisation, the lottery as a product, house specific information around gambling commission, winner stories, and content like that. The use of subdomains and microsites isn't about dodging data source categorization. Dodging anything is not a strategy, but actually subdomains work particularly well. And so we would advocate, if you're not doing that and your main site and pixel has been categorized and you think that's unfair, then you could look at that route. Campaigns run for first party data collection absolutely must be in your plan. So again, I mentioned about lead generation and then using perhaps telephone to convert those leads. You are less vulnerable if you're taking control of first party data. And even in a restricted situation, you can still generate first party data. It just means that you can't use Meta end to end, for example. And then the final piece on pixel is please use a different pixel per website. So we see some organizations that are using pixels or a pixel across multiple different data sources or multiple different sites. So for example, if you want to generate an audience of individuals who are engaging and absorbing your brand and communications type content, you don't want to muddle that necessarily with individuals who are visiting your lottery website. Sharing data and making data adjustments between them is absolutely relevant, but typically you want to keep those separate. And in the example I gave before, where an organizational pixel may be restricted, but the lottery pixel is not, a subdomain with a clean pixel just for that domain will inevitably enable you to do that. So conclusion, essentially, I think depending on how you view this, it feels like this is a hurdle, but I think and I'd hope that you'd all agree that this is probably a necessary hurdle because again, this is all about the protection of the privacy of consumers, and that can only be a good thing. There is still a huge opportunity around how Meta is used. This is really just one view on one way that you could be more effective with Meta, and I'd suggest there's probably 4 or 5 other ways that you can be more effective with Meta. One of which is the way in which you buy media across the funnel approach. Another is creative that we've already shared as well. And again, by doing that, we're able to have a far more direct relationship with potential supporters. This only really applies to paid activity. Anything organic is unchanged really. Yeah, certainly still a big opportunity for Meta from an advertising perspective. And then just last page really before I open up to questions. If you'd like to chat through anything that we've gone through today, please reach out. My email address is at the end of this deck. If you want to talk about creative or funnel building and all those sorts of good things, then please just schedule a follow-up chat. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you'd like a copy of the walkthrough that has more detail and what you should be looking for and potential things that you can change, then please just request that. And likewise, you can have a copy of the deck and the recording and things once they're available. At the end of the last session we ran this session a few weeks ago, we were offering free Meta Business Manager audits, and they went down particularly well. So we've decided to open those up again. So if you're a charity and you'd like us to look at your business manager and go through this with you, then we are also very, very happy to do so. At the end of the deck, we've got references, so you can see where we got this information from. It's not all just made up. With that, I shall bring us to a close. So nearly 1:45, so pretty much bang on time. I said I wanted it to be about 45 minutes. So I'll stop sharing and then I'll open up to questions for 5 minutes or so, and then we shall let you get back to work.
Great, thank you, George. We have just a couple of questions, both from Lizzie Stanger. Apologies, Lizzie, if I've pronounced that wrong. The first one is, with the full restrictions, you mentioned potential performance dwindle over time. Is there any indication from Meta that restrictions are causing this?
Not particularly, and we've had a number of conversations with charities recently about this topic. You're not always told that you're in core setup. There's not typically a pop-up message or an email to tell you, so you've got to go and search for the restriction. If you're in full restriction, you are told. If you're in core setup, generally speaking, you're not. But the content we just went through will enable you to go and have a look at that. We have had cases where core setup is not enabled, but there's clearly a restriction, and that's required direct intervention from the organisation to Meta via a support case.
Lovely, thank you. And then again from Lizzie, if our ads are supported by our media agency account, could their activity be impacting our restrictions despite our content not being in the impacted data source categories?
It will depend on how the data sources are linked. So, for example, if your agency is using their own ad account and you have your own organizational ad account, then typically those two pieces of activity will be considered separate. So the agency pixel will be going into the agency ad account, and the organizational pixel will be going into the organizational ad account, and therefore they're not linked really. But if the agency is using your ad account, but it has a pixel, its own agency pixel on your website with very specific content, that could absolutely have an impact. And we've seen a number of cases like that.
Brilliant, thank you.
So sorry, just to bolt on there. One thing you can look at doing is then separating the pixels, as I mentioned earlier, and also potentially separating your ad account.
Brilliant. And then, so Rachel, to request a free Meta Business Manager audit, just email George, or you can email myself. I'll put our emails in the chat in a second. And Jenny has asked if she can have a copy of the recording. Yes. So all charities will be sent a copy of the slides and the recording in the coming days. And that is that is it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you for that. If there are any other questions that have come through after the session, then what we did last time is we just put those all together and we can share those questions. But if you have any specific direct questions for us, then as Jordan says, please get in touch. Thank you very much, all. Have a good rest of your day. Have a good rest of your week, and we hope to speak to you soon. Bye bye.